One of the first things I always tell myself is never be surprised when I walk into a big organization,
Mhm.
because they're just dominated by bureaucracy and confusion. I have seen some things, yeah, when I document the processes. For instance, I was at one organization, and a lot of teams are stood up based on knee-jerk reaction. So this particular case, there was a problem with statements where they were showing wrong numbers to customers. Obviously, a big deal. So, how do you construct a model of the environment? Well, you need a common semantic structure. And the best one to do that is, what does my business do? Now, I haven't seen this yet, but where I think this is going is with AI agents. And I think this becomes really exciting. Now, let's say I'm doing a transformation program, I could not only educate AI on what my business does, but estimating models, et cetera. So now I could say, here's the transformation program that I want to do. And there are cases in the US where lawyers have cited previous court cases to back up their arguments. But then when the judge looks at it, they say, there's one problem, these cases don't exist. But it's like, fact check the thing.
Talk about this bookending approach. It's like AI doesn't take away your responsibility, your professional responsibilities check. But it's the same as a Google search, isn't it? You wouldn't trust a Google search. You've got to fact check it. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Project Flux podcast. Today on the spotlight, we are joined by Michael Schank. Michael Schank is a digital transformation and operational excellence consultant. I think I've got that right. And the author of the book, Digital Transformation Success. And there it is, as Michael's holding up.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for joining us, Michael, and for flashing the book up.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, guys. It's my pleasure.
Excellent.
Cool. So, Michael, you just flagged the book up, and I've just seen the front cover. Just a very quick question. What drives your inspiration behind the front cover?
So it really goes back to my 25 plus years as a consultant working with various companies. So I started as a technologist, and I was a Java, C++ programmer, solution architect, et cetera. But then as I moved, that was Accenture for 13 years. Then I moved to EY for 10 years. And at that point, they did not have a strong technology practice. So I started moving into different projects. One of the first projects was a large bank in the US said, hey, create a capability model. So we interviewed people. I think it was a 6-week project, interviewed some people in the business to lay out a map of what they did. And it was just an epiphany moment for me, because as a technologist, I had no idea, literally no idea what the business did, other than I was a banking customer. So I knew basic banking. But it was just an epiphany moment that I get to see everything that a bank does on a page. And I thought it was just so powerful. So I dedicated myself to really serving clients from that perspective. And I served them in a bunch of different capacities, from helping them define their strategy, design IT architecture, do risk and compliance, run transformation programs, you name it. And I kept seeing patterns throughout this of why they fail. And it stuck with me how this framework that I thought was so powerful could be useful. So that's where I really realized that business capability models, if you're not familiar with them, don't go far enough, that you really need to get down to the details of what an organization does through understanding all of their processes. So I developed the framework, applied it in many different financial services situations, and it always seemed to work. So I was just felt compelled that I finally needed to get it on paper, and my hope is that people adopt it and really see the benefits from it.
Cool. And we'll come on to the framework as well. I think you call it the process inventory framework.
That's right.
But just relating back to you, so you've had many, many years experience working in the finance industry and outside, and you've come into many different pain points that you've solved within digital transformation. What's playing on your mind right now?
It's just getting the word out and getting people to adopt it. The root cause of transformation failures, and it's a ubiquitous stat and it's been challenged, but 70% of transformations fail. I think the fundamental root cause from my perspective is just the complexity of these organizations. They have very complex people, process, technology, regulatory environments, and no one has a full understanding of everything. So it's really important that to flip that 70% failure rate and turn it into 70% success, organizations need to do the hard work to understand what they do.
Yeah. And just within that, then, where do you see the biggest sticking point? in digital transformation?
It's really lack of alignment and lack of systems thinking. So alignment is, and I talk about it in the book, but there's two parts of it. There's vertical alignment. So everyone from the CEO, all the senior leadership down to individual contributors that are writing requirements or operating a process, building code, making sure that everyone's aligned and they're working towards the strategic direction of the organization. Everyone knows their role and they're contributing towards that. And then there's horizontal alignment. So within an organization, there's a lot of peer teams of different practitioner types. So you have the business and technology and risk and data and you name it, you could go on and on, making sure that those teams can collaborate effectively to advance the goals of the strategy. And then the second part is systems thinking, which is understanding that our organizations are composed of many different components of technology and people and third-party vendors, you name it. And systems thinking is really about understanding how all those parts connect and how they individually drive performance. So if you as a leader are defining a transformation strategy and you have clarity on how everything connects and getting alignment with people, that will get you to success in these large efforts.
Can I ask you a question, Michael? So you mentioned at the beginning, when you went into these organizations, you got them to write down on paper everything that they did. And you've worked for some massive organizations. Were you surprised by what you saw when they wrote it down, i.e., that there wasn't as much kind of joined up thinking as you think that there might be with these big organizations?
Well, one of the first things I always tell myself is never be surprised when I walk into a big organization. Because they're just dominated by bureaucracy and confusion. I've seen some things, when I document the processes. For instance, I was at one organization, and a lot of teams are stood up based on knee-jerk reaction. So this particular case, there was a problem with statements where they were showing wrong numbers to customers. Obviously, a big deal. So they stood up a statements team to govern it, quote unquote. But when I really dug into what they do, they didn't really have a role other than just to be watchers of watchers who watch the watchers. And you'll see a lot of that layers that just build up over time, really evolves over time without kind of some intentionality behind it.
Yeah. So now we're moving into this kind of AI era, and particularly the agentic era, which is meant to be all based on workflows. Presumably, it's very important what you're talking about, because you've got to get your processes in order before you can agentize them, for want of a better word.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
So,
Okay.
Go on, Michael.
I was going to say I think that's one of the failures of automation and AI right now. I think is a lack of understanding of the end-to-end processes, and I define it a little bit differently than conventional process management thinks of it, because they really define it as understanding upstream and downstream processes, which I think is really important. But I think there's two other aspects that are important. One is having a comprehensive understanding of every process, because there'll be gaps and there'll be like bureaucratic processes that slow things down. So really understanding the full landscape. And then the second aspect of it is aligning data. So
Yes.
Our organizations have a lot of operational data that's locked in various siloed repositories that are unconnected, that have different indexing structures. So relating, my application repository to what my risks are versus what my issues are versus how it supports my products. If you can't understand that, you don't really have the context to understand automation and how AI could support your organization.
And you've touched on alignment a few times, and I've also seen you touched on alignment within previous podcasts recently. Can you speak more about, elaborating on alignment and then kind of touching into how your process inventory framework kind of ties into that?
Yeah, I'll start right up front with the strategy. So in a typical strategy process, leaders will evaluate their vision and mission. So why do you exist and where are you going in the future? But as part of that, you'll do an environment analysis. So what's the external environment? So competitive landscape, regulatory, economic, et cetera. And then you also do an internal analysis. So where are we strong and weak relative to expectations of where we want to be? Now, if you have a full map of the organization of all the processes, but rolled up at 30,000 foot view level, now it could be complete in that analysis, and they could create a heat map where they're in typical SWOT framework. Where are we strong and weak? Where are there opportunities and threats? Now that enables these strategic decision makers to make priority decisions, and then be more objective in where they align funding to various initiatives. But then you could carry that through to the change management process of, once I have that funding aligned, I could create charters that specify which process areas or which processes are impacted by that. But if I've aligned all my data, now I know who the process owner is, who has to sign off on stuff. I know what technology it uses. I know what development teams are associated with that technology. I really have the full landscape and I can be precise in what I'm changing. But you could also align every single deliverable in a change management project, from your charter to your requirements, your design documents, your testing, your organizational change management process, to align to what processes are changing. And that just keeps everything aligned. From now, my strategic leaders have defined what the strategy is in the next 1 to 3 years. And then there's a very strong and tangible tie to what they have to do to implement that project successfully.
And can you just give us an example of what a process inventory framework might look like in any industry?
Yeah. So one example that I had was, I worked at an insurance company that was being spun off from a larger global insurance company. It was a US life and annuities business.
Mhm.
And they made some strategic decisions up front that they didn't want to inherit any of the old parents' technology environment, because they thought it was overly complex and overly costly, which it was. So we spent a few weeks and just defined what their business areas are, aligned to the organizational hierarchy. So we followed who managed what, and laid out at just 2 or 3 levels, not very deep, of what they did. And then we did some strategy sessions around what they envisioned that for the future. But in those sessions, we defined some strategic imperatives. And it was really just 1 or 2 things. It's either best in class or best in cost. And best in class being, these are customer facing and we really want to deliver a good experience, versus best in cost, we just have to be good enough, like your back office finance or whatnot. That really enabled.
Is there a trade-off there, presumably, between the cost and if you want the best in class, it comes at a cost, presumably?
It comes at a higher investment, higher, different requirements for what vendors you choose and the people you hire to implement that. So absolutely. And that went into budgeting for their long-term program. I think it was like a 4 or 5 year program, because it was kind of a startup. They had billions of dollars in assets. So, it took them a while to build that. But that helped them define their transformation roadmap, make priority decisions around what programs they want to start first. And then we carried that through, like I mentioned, the SDLC. So we documented all the processes, aligned requirements to it, aligned testing. And it was one of the smoothest transformations I've been a part of.
Cool. And just in that then, with the advent of AI,
Mhm.
generative AI, analytical AI, how can you see the process inventory framework and AI marrying together?
Yeah, so I was reading this Deloitte State of the AI report, where they asked leaders, where do you want to see AI go next? And the plurality of people responded with, they want AI deeply embedded in their processes and functions. You can't do that unless you know what your processes are. And there's this concept called digital twin, which is big in manufacturing. In terms of software, I think it's a $183 billion industry, and it's growing 40% annually every year. So it's a big deal, but it's really about creating a virtual model of your real world environment, and then educating AI on what your business does, so that you could feed it data around any operational signal, like, what are my defects? What are my issues? What are my customer complaints? What's coming from my process mining data? Now, once you have that, now AI can analyze every bit of your operating environment and look at, where's our cost over what the value is for that area? Where do we have customer issues? So that need to be addressed before they become problems. And you could go on down the line. It's been big in manufacturing because it's more physically tangible. It's easy for me to model a factory floor, and there's a lot of smart factories out there that do this.
It's getting bigger and bigger in construction, actually, which is what a lot of our listeners are in. So
Exactly.
huge use cases there.
I think from what I've researched, no one's really tackled that in more information-based businesses.
Mhm.
So I come from financial services. People could be located really anywhere around the world, and teams can be divided, et cetera. So there's no physically tangible way to do that. So how do you construct a model of the environment? Well, you need a common semantic structure. And the best one to do that is, what does my business do, by inventorying every single process. So once I have that, I can align all the data, I could create the digital twin, et cetera. Now, I haven't seen this yet, but where I think this is going is with AI agents. And I think this becomes really exciting. Now I could, let's say I'm doing a transformation program, I could not only educate AI on what my business does, but estimating models, et cetera. So now I could say, here's the transformation program that I want to do. And you could have agents in a multi-agent environment. One go into your repository of processes and all the operational intelligence and understand all the impacts. What are the processes that are changing? What's all the resources that are back it, et cetera. And then now it could send it to another agent that creates essentially your work plan. So how many resources are needed, what code needs to be changed, and lay out your plan with detailed estimates for who needs to do what, does dependency analysis, you name it. You could do automated risk assessments. I think eventually you could create code by having an understanding of what the impacts are and do automated testing and deployment through CI/CD pipelines. I think a lot of things are possible, but it's not possible if you don't have that context of what your business does.
Yeah, well, we're very excited with the whole agentic revolution happening here at Project Flux because, like you, we see the huge potential, and especially when you look at it, doesn't matter whether it's financial services or construction consultancy. When the business is built up on processes, and all of a sudden we've got a new technology which, in theory, can do those processes, that's going to free up a lot of time. The one kind of pushback I get sometimes, and I'd love your view on this, is it's all well and good AI coming in and replicating a process that in some industries may have been around for hundreds of years or at least decades. Is that always the best strategy? Is it not better sometimes to say, actually, let's start from scratch?
In terms of start from scratch in terms of
like if there's a process that you've done, you do to come to some output, let's say construction consultancy as an example, project management, this is the way that we've always done it. This is the process. That might be just a product of time and habit, and we've always done it that way. And if you create an agentic workflow to replicate that, yes, you're speeding it up, but is there not an argument? So let's have a look at the whole process in the first place. Is it the right process for the 21st century or beyond?
Yeah. I think that's a great point. With process inventory, you could capture current state. So if you have this laid out of how everything works, what processes you do, you could take a step back and say, let's rethink this whole thing. I think that's absolutely valid. And then you could map your future state. So what's the processes in the new environment and how should this work? And then create your digital twin or align AI automation to that new thing. It really depends on the context of the organization and what's important for them, and budget, timing, all these factors need to go into it.
Has that ever happened with you? Have you ever done that? You sat down, like you said at the beginning, all the processes on a piece of paper, and you've looked and then said, why are you doing it like this?
Oh, yeah, all the time. I mean, because I think organizations, and I mentioned this earlier, they evolve. They don't necessarily have intentionality in what they're going to do. So they just add teams and they add layers, but they don't really think about, what does this really make sense? Is it slowing some things down? And I think taking that step back every so often is really important.
So what do you do when you see organizations who are evolving?
That's a good question. It's I'm going to pause to think about this. I think it really comes down to helping them map out what they do and take a step back and do that kind of lean Six Sigma analysis of looking for waste and inefficiencies. And that's one of my challenges with Lean and Six Sigma. What I've seen practically is people are just looking at a process or two and how to optimize it. But really, if you create this whole inventory and map out the organization, now you could look at the organization from a 30,000 foot view level and find redundancies and overlaps. So a lot of times, especially let's say technology, there'll be an organization who purchases a bit of software that already does functionality that another organization with the same company already provides. So that overlap creates more cost in terms of management and licenses, but also just creates complexity, which means that if I need to change something, I have more complexity to deal with to get that done.
Yeah, and processes themselves, it helps you deliver where you want to get to from point A to point B in the most optimal way, right?
Yeah, that's right.
But at times when they aren't aligned to the people within the company or the business, you start to form these shadow systems, right? And this is how people get things done without following official procedure. Does process inventory framework account for those shadow systems?
Oh, you absolutely have to. I mean, my goal is to capture everything. But there's a lot of shadow IT organizations where people, and I think the fundamental issue is they can't trust technology to get them what they need on the right timing. And I think that's a factor of enterprise architecture and technology teams as a whole just don't really have an understanding of what the business does. So they create their strategy, they do governance on what technology is being implemented, but without that understanding of what the business does. And I could say that from personal experience, being a former technologist, that you really can't have a good strategy. You really can't have a good discussion with the business around where they're going in the next 1 to 3 years or 5 years, and understand where their priorities are, and then have those decisions before it really becomes pressing where the business says, I need this and I don't care about your standards, just implement something.
Yeah.
So do you think there's a risk though with building processes, or identifying those processes, that there is a risk of over engineering?
No, because my first and foremost, I think it's just about documenting what already exists. I think there could be a trade-off, and this has come up before, between having this detailed understanding and innovation. And I actually disagree with that, because there's a lot of different innovation models that are appearing. There's external innovation where you look at customers and the broader market to generate new ideas. But there's now democratic innovation where you look at your people in your company and you say everyone has some level of expertise in what they do. So I could tap into that if I give them two things. One is a culture of autonomy, where I say, I encourage you to test new ideas, understanding that not everything's going to work, but coming from that, we're going to generate some really good ideas and drive some improvement in our environment. But the second part of that is accountability, making sure people are accountable for what they own, and then now they could drive innovations in that, because they have that sense of ownership. But one of the things I think you need to do is arm them with information, so people don't understand the upstream processes, the downstream, all the impacts. So they really can't drive change or generate new ideas. But if you give them this repository of information, now they could do that.
So do you think that companies, at the top end, need to be more transparent with their AI strategies to those, on the ground floor?
And I would say yes, and I wouldn't limit that just to AI strategies. I think there's a lot of companies I've come across that state certain strategic imperatives, but people on the ground aren't connected with it. So I was talking to one friend, they're like, my CEO says we're going to be cloud first. He's like, I have no idea what that means to me.
Nice
So I
buzzword.
think being transparent of whatever you're trying to do, I think is important to get that alignment.
So you mentioned that dynamic, right? Is it empowerment and having the information? No, empowerment and the other one that you mentioned. But in that, how does that dynamic play out between reaching a short-term vision in AI strategy and a long-term vision in AI strategy?
I think you have to have an understanding of what your foundation is for your strategy. So if your goal is, to that state of the AI report that I mentioned, if your goal is to deeply embed AI in processes and functions, you need to understand that you need to know what those processes are. So you got to think about what your strategy is and what foundational pieces you need to put in place. Now, that being said, you don't have to implement this for an entire organization, especially for organizations that have multiple business lines that are global. Like, that would be just a massive undertaking. But you could take one individual business unit, document all the processes, align all the data, create AI for that, and then show how the advanced analytics that you would receive from it really helps your business. And then once you get that, now you could expand to other areas, because other businesses will want that insight.
So use it as a test case almost.
As a test case.
Yeah.
So when you run these test cases, sorry, James, how do you know when the project is succeeding?
Ultimately, it's business performance.
Mm-hmm.
And that starts whenever you do one of these efforts. I think you need to sit down with the business and understand their priorities from their perspective, and then align what you're doing from a process perspective to that. So if it's cost and efficiency, well, I need to understand where the resources are in terms of people, dollars, et cetera, so that I could align and prove, look, I'm providing transparency that's allowing you to be more efficient with dollars. If it's customer success, then am I getting better metrics from my customer surveys, or am I getting better engagement or repeat business? Whatever it may be, I think you need to draw that alignment, because those strategy alignment will give you the right understanding of what metrics you're targeting, and then what resources you need to pull into this.
Just on I've got a quick question on the whole AI strategy piece as well, because it's something I've been pondering quite a lot recently, having talked to a few people. Everyone's kind of putting together some kind of AI strategy, but how do you do it when it's moving so fast? And it's almost impossible to guess where we're going to be in a year's time, let alone 3 or 4 years' time. And even if you do put something down in paper now, it's very likely to be outdated, maybe even next week. Have you come across this before at all?
Yeah, and a lot of organizations, and they're particularly scared about obviously the data security aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
But I really believe that if you really want to embed AI into your process and functions, you do need this foundation. And then think of it as componentized. If there's different LLM models or different technologies or tools, you're just really plugging into the foundation of what you do as an organization. I think regardless of how technology is moving, this foundation is still critical.
Yeah, okay. You don't think that kind of whole process that you're going through and you've outlined in your book, that the steps are still going to be the same. It just might be introducing slightly different technology effectively as it improves.
Exactly.
So at the start of the very podcast, Michael, you introduced your book, Digital Transformation Success. And in that, you speak to some of these drivers like the process inventory framework. Just on that book, what is one chapter you think that people will take a lot of value from? What's that key point?
Well, it's probably chapter 2, where I lay out the framework and the different components. The big thing to understand is you're creating a unified model of how your organization works. And in process management, there's a lot of different model types that people talk about. There's value streams for your end to end, from how you identify or generate an idea to delivering value. There's customer journeys that are also end to end, but from an outside in perspective. There's business capability models, there's process taxonomies, there's process models, there's data, and it really connects all the dots in terms of how all these need to work together to create one view of your organization that different people could look at from their vantage point and get value, but it's all grounded in the same truth of your organization.
And you've been doing this for many years, and digital transformation evolves as technology evolves and the system around it evolves. Are there things that you or thoughts you believed 5 or 10 years ago that you now think, I would do this differently?
Well, my thinking on this topic has evolved quite a bit. As I mentioned, I started as a business architect, and I was thinking business capabilities, if you guys are familiar with it, are the anchor point. But it's not, because the definition of business capability is it's organizationally agnostic. So if I'm managing accounts, I'll have one capability for that. But in multi-business lines, I may be doing that in many different places. So when I was at one of the large banks, for instance, you can open an account, a mortgage account, you can open an account in retail bank, you can open a credit card account, a wealth account, et cetera, et cetera. Well, these use all different, obviously, people, different procedures, different technology, you name it, have different risk profiles. You need to understand the details of all of those, especially if you're going to drive standardization, because you need to understand how different things work today and how they need to change. If I'm driving a shared service strategy, I need to understand what I need to pull in and what services I need to provide, or even outsourcing. And that's where I've evolved, is you've got to capture all the processes for every organization. And I think, a lot of organizations are looking for easy buttons. When RPA hit the scene, everyone was creating RPA centers of excellence, process mining. Oh, we're going to solve all our problems with process mining. They're good in certain circumstances, but it lacks the context of the broader organization. Your value is going to be limited depending on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to manage performance at the enterprise level, those can't do it. You really need to understand what your enterprise does.
So do you think that AI is similar to RPA in terms of the impact that it will have and how businesses have carried out? Or do you think it's on a different trajectory?
Well, I think it's more powerful for sure. I think most organizations right now, I'll make a blanket statement, are using it on the periphery of your processes. So
definitely, I agree with that.
I could feed it a bunch of documents, and now it could help me answer questions or be insightful about products or whatever I need to answer for a customer. Obviously, chatbots, there's a lot of different things. But so it's super powerful. But I think to really get the value, you need to embed it in your processes. Like I just think it would be a game changer if your whole organization was oriented around putting this in there, just like in manufacturing, they have smart factories.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's something I'm quite passionate about, and I speak a lot about, is the culture change. So how important is that when you go through the process? Because, you could have the best technology in the world and you could have the perfect process map in the world, but changing people's habits, I find really, really hard. So right now, I know a lot of organizations, for instance, that have deployed Copilot across the organization at the quite significant cost, because it's not cheap. But when you actually ask them how many people are using it, it's tiny percentage. And when you ask that tiny percentage, are you using it for anything other than helping you craft an email slightly better? It's basically zero. And then it makes me realize, hang on, we're missing a huge piece here. Yes, we're cracking the technology, but we really need to think about how we change the culture in organizations.
Yeah. Well, I would assume they're probably lacking the why. So
Yeah.
why are they deploying Copilot, and what behaviors do they want to see from their people? How are they measuring it? Not everything has to be measured when you're driving culture, but how are you encouraging people to use it? And how are you educating and training? Like, I think there's a lot of factors that go into it.
Well, it's interesting actually. It's one of my bugbears because I think actually Copilot's a great product. I mean, it's not just one product, is it? It's like a collection of products. And we had someone from Microsoft on recently on the podcast to talk about this. I don't think they do a very good job of the marketing around it. And also, I think that what happens is, and I'm guessing, I don't know this, I'm guessing that the reason why companies deploy it is because Microsoft will give the CIOs a good deal and he'll deploy it because he thinks he's got a good deal without really thinking about through, we've got to have some training and upskilling that goes with this.
Yeah.
And which is great because Microsoft's happy, CIO's happy, but it's actually coming at a cost because then the people that do use it get a bad result from it, and then it's really hard to get those people back on the bus after they've had a bad experience.
Yeah. Well, I don't think we're at the point where we could trust the data that comes out of it. There's been some cases in the US where lawyers have cited previous court cases to back up their arguments. But then when the judge looks at it, they say, there's one problem. These cases don't exist.
Yeah, I've heard of
So
that.
what the main lawyers failed to do is like fact check the thing.
Yeah. Well, this is what we talk about, this bookending approach. It's like AI doesn't take away your responsibility, your professional responsibilities check. Well, it's the same as a Google search, isn't it? You wouldn't trust a Google search. You've got to fact check it.
Exactly. Yeah,
It's
I think
fascinating, isn't it? It's fascinating.
you need to look at it as an assistant, and you wouldn't, even if you hired an assistant, a human assistant, you wouldn't necessarily trust everything they say. That trust builds over time, but you ultimately, you're accountable for what you put in an email, the decisions you make, and you still have to retain that ownership.
Yeah.
Michael, in the companies you work with, what is the most popular AI they use?
That's a great question. I'll actually say a lot of companies, I think because of the data security, haven't really deployed AI at scale yet. So I think I really don't have an answer to that question, to be honest with you, because I think I've seen a lot of organizations where I worked with one bank recently, and I was creating process inventories, and I was reading their procedure documents because I like to do the homework and create a first draft. And I'm like, this would be so easy if I could feed it to ChatGPT and create a list. And they didn't have it within their environment. So I think they're struggling with data security, and banking is probably more conservative than other industries. So they're a little bit hesitant to deploy it at scale.
Yeah, I was you worked at EY, didn't you? So we did a talk at EY's offices not long ago, and they said that they've actually have deployed their own AI tool. I can't remember what it was called. I think it was EYX or something like that, which is its own local large language model. I think they've got it locally hosted, and they seem to be having some really, really good success with it. So I think there's some pockets of even big companies deploying AI in a really good way. But I think it goes to, there's the risk, isn't there, that if I can understand the concerns around data security, et cetera, but with going back to what Yoshi was talking about before with shadow AI, if you do that too much, you run the risk of people just using their own personal accounts, and that's more risky.
Exactly. Yeah. The other thing that I think is important is AI, to be effective, has to have good data. Yeah. And a lot of these large organizations just don't have good data. So they not only need to deploy it, but they need to have a strategy so AI can decipher the incomplete documents, the conflicting documents, and really give you a true story. So I think in addition to deploying AI, I think you need to really think about data.
Yeah, and that all comes from doing the process in the first place. So you know where the data's coming from, right?
Yeah, you have that common semantic structure to align everything to.
Yeah. And ask you a question. Sorry, Yoshi.
No, you go, mate. You go.
I was just going to say, the listeners to this podcast, we get all types. So we'll have people with startups, SMEs, and people working for the large organizations, no doubt, for some of the firms we've mentioned. Is it easier to do what you're outlining for a large organization who have got sort of a bit of money and gravitas behind them, or is it easier when you've got a startup or an SME, or is it just different levels of trickiness?
It's different levels of trickiness. Yeah, because obviously large organizations, you have so much to capture. So when I was at at Citi, I was doing this at scale for the US retail bank. And in about a year and a half, I did about 60% of the processes. And when I extrapolate that forward, I estimated there probably would have been about 10,000 processes. Very
Right,
complex
wow.
business. So there's a lot to capture, a lot of interviews that have to take place. For a small business, I think it's obviously easier because you have less going on. And I think it might be more valuable. So a new startup, for instance, they're going to go through different phases. The first phase is going to be just growth. And you're not necessarily going to think about it efficiency. You're going to be focused on getting to the market, gaining, growing revenue, et cetera. But then you get to a point where efficiency really matters.
Yeah.
And capturing all this and understanding how you're using your resources. And, if you're starting to develop bureaucracy or overlaps, to make sure that you address that with a full understanding.
Yeah. And there is so much in the space, and there's so much transformation that needs to happen. And the process inventory framework is a starting point which we definitely feel can fit into the agentic framework, because it's all reliant on systems and frameworks. Conscious that we're coming to the end of the podcast, but Michael, going outside of your digital transformation work that you've been doing for these many, many years and the expertise that you've built up, if you weren't working in transformation and consulting, what would you be doing?
That's a great question.
We like that one.
I think I'm past the age to be a professional athlete, which was my dream when I was a kid.
What about guitarist? I see the guitar in your background.
I could be a guitarist. I'm very early on the path, so maybe bassist.
That's the easy option.
I've heard that if you play bass, there's more opportunities to join a band. So maybe that's my path.
And just on this journey that you're having with digital transformation, what would you want people to see your legacy as?
Really setting a new standard for how to be successful in managing performance at an organization. So I think the epiphany that I had is that there's a lot of frameworks out there today. If you think about like business architecture, ITIL, Scrum, et cetera, but nothing really connects the dots of them. They all solve point problems, but without that connection to the larger business context and how it fits in and how they could work together, that's a missing component that I think all organizations can use.
Awesome.
Cool. Can I just ask a question, like on a broader scale, because it's really difficult to kind of predict where AI is going. If we were to look, there's a lot of talk about things like AGI and ASI and micro companies and AI basically taking over everything. What's your view on it? Where do you think we're going to be in 10 years' time?
So I think it's going to have a huge impact. So I've been skeptical of a lot of technology advances like RPA.
Yeah.
Process mining, have some level of skepticism. I'm not skeptical about AI. I think it's really going to be revolutionary.
Real deal.
I'm not fatalist, though, that it's going to take all our jobs and we're going to be slaves to it. I mean, if you've seen The Matrix, we're not going to end up in pods where they tap into our energy sources, et cetera. I think we're going to have to find an equilibrium with it, where how we could work with it and leverage it to advance our businesses and advance our lives. But I think this equilibrium, it can't be the sole means of production where it's creating products and services that we can't use because we're poor.
Yeah. It's going to be a fun ride over the next few years, I think. And there's going to be, there's so many different opinions. There's going to be quite a lot of people who are wrong, that's for sure.
Yeah, the speculation's all over the map, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for the podcast. I've noticed we've just hit the 40-minute mark, so we're coming to the end. Just before we close up, can you give us some more information about where we can find your book, Digital Transformation Success?
Yeah, it's on Amazon, so pick it up. It's a great read. And if you want to find me, I post regularly on LinkedIn, so Michael Schank, easy to find. And then I do my own consulting. So if you're interested in my services, creating strategies, creating process center of excellence, modeling your business, and training, I do training as well. I could be found at processinventory.com.
Excellent.
We'll put those links in the show notes as well.
Perfect.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Michael. Thank you, James, as well for joining us. And thank you, guys. And we'll see you in the next episode.
Thank you for having me.
Bye, everyone.
Project Flux is here.
That's a wrap for today's episode. But before you go, exciting news. Project Flux is teaming up with Project Management Global to bring you the latest in AI-driven project delivery and essential management insights. Through this partnership, expect weekly AI insights, practical tools, and expert thought leadership, ensuring you stay ahead in the evolving project landscape. Stay tuned for exclusive content, joint research, and strategies to supercharge your project outcomes. You can learn more at www.pm-global.co.uk and be part of the future of project management. See you later.
Project Flux is here.
Just want to give a big shout out to our sponsors, Construct AI. For anyone interested in looking at Construct AI, the link's in our show notes. There's a free tier that you can play around with. Yoshi and I have been using it for a good year since it was originally launched, and we get a huge amount of value out of it. So I thoroughly encourage everyone to go onto the Construct AI site and have a play around.
Cool. And guys, before we sign off, please don't forget to share, follow, and like all of our stuff. So that helps us to engage with you and understand a bit more about what you want so we can bring it to your doorstep as early as possible.
See you later, everyone.